If you're struggling with automations in Jira, this video is going to be for you. We're going to cover automations from A to Z, and by the end of this video, you're going to be an absolute master at half of your work that you do in Jira daily. We're going to be covering basic automations and then going all the way to very complex automations, and all of these are real-world scenarios, automations that we use in our clients' environments actively and that we use internally at grid.io daily. Let's jump in. There are two places that we find automations inside of Jira. The first place is when we're inside of a project. So I'll go ahead and open up a random queue in my IT project. I'll click the three dots here and I'll go to project settings, and then I'll find my automations tab. The one thing to note with this automation tab is that it's only associated to things within this single project. So if you're running any kind of cross-project automations, if you want to run automations between assets in Jira, you can't actually do that in here. That being said, after you create an automation and you sync them across multiple projects, that's when they do show up here. But to access your automations on a global level, where you could do all that cross-project stuff, and you could have your assets in there and a couple of other more advanced things, what you're gonna have to do is go to the settings icon on the top right, then we'll go to our system, and then we'll go to global automation. And when we're in this tab, this is where we get access to pretty much everything. Now, do keep in mind that this is only available to site org admins, so you may not have access to this view, but I'll be using this just as a reference. But essentially, all of these same things that I'll be covering are available on the project level as well. So a quick overview of the UI. At the very front page, we're brought to rules, which is just our list of automations. Jira essentially calls them rules, and you could scroll through them, find them. You could add labels to them to make it a little bit easier, and you could also filter by specific actions, owners, and things like that. If you ever get lost and don't know where your automation is, for example, there's quite a bit in this environment, I could go in and find things by a specific action. So maybe I'm looking for something that assigns a work item, so I could add that as the action. I have assign work item, and then these are the ones that actually assign work items, and I could easily find them. Same thing with owners or triggers or labels, makes it super easy to filter down and find exactly what you need. This is fairly new, was dropped in the past year, and it's made life a whole lot easier for individuals who have a lot of rules. So I'll clear that out. So that's a really quick trick to use. You could also search by the title or the name. So if you type in clone, that should bring up all of the items with clone. So just keep that in mind if you're ever searching for your automations. That being said, I do have a recommendation for your naming scheme. I always like to name based on the trigger, and then I do an arrow to the action. And I'll show you when I actually build this automation how I name them and why. The other thing to note is labels. Labels are super handy to keep things very, very organized, especially when you have a long list like this. For example, recurring is a good label. Assets is a good label if you're using a lot of those kinds of automation. You could do things like assignee, you could do things like transitions, you could really get creative with your labels and stack them if you'd like. You could have more than one. So definitely use those for, that way you can essentially block these together in a way and have different groups of them to easily filter on them later. All right, so that's gonna be our rules tab. Then we have the audit log, and this is a place to see all of your automation runs across your entire Jira environment. And I tend not to use this unless I'm looking for something that ran within a specific time frame. And the reason I don't use it is because it runs every single rule, and it's very difficult to find when you have 50 rules running at once exactly what's happening. So what I do instead is I just go to the rule and I open it, and then there's an audit log in here for just this specific rule, which narrows it down to just that one item, and you get a lot more quicker of a result to be able to see if something's erroring out and why. So audit log in here, useful for time-based, but not useful for debugging and trying to figure out why a specific automation may not be running. There's also some templates that Jira offers out of the box. Some of these are great, actually. So if you had a specific use case like assigning subtasks, things like that, you could search through and actually find them, drop them in. It might be a little bit quicker and easier for you to get started. This is also something I recommend doing if you're very new. So just grab a quick automation, see how they're structured, see how they work, see how Atlassian wants you to think about automations, which if you're watching this video, you probably won't need to do that afterwards, but it is a good way to kind of get an understanding of how your automations should be used and how Atlassian recommends using them. So go back to my templates. Then we have usage, and this is a great place to see what your total usage limit is. In this environment, I have unlimited, but your free, your standard, and premium environments are all limited. Unless you're on enterprise, you are going to be limited. So keep an eye on this, and you will get notifications as your month goes on and your usage grows. it'll say like 50% used. It may even say your usage limit won't last the amount of time for this particular duration, in which case you could jump in here and actually see which ones have been used the most. So super handy to go in and be like, okay, this has been running hundreds of times versus all the other ones, which are, just a few times. And it's great to reduce your total automation usage. So that's a quick UI overview. If we want to start by creating our very first rule, we'll just go to the very top right. And then once again, we have an option to create from template and from scratch. There is an option to create with AI. I have tried this. It is not very good as of today, and it doesn't work very well. It doesn't really get what I'm trying to do most of the time. And usually when I personally want to use this, I am trying to do something more complex. All the basic stuff I could pretty much do faster than prompting with AI. So at least for myself, I just find it not very useful. So let's jump in and start creating our very first automation. So I'll create my first rule and I'll use the create from scratch. And I'm going to discard all my recent changes. And we're met with this panel. On the right side, we could drag in certain actions or click on it and place certain actions. And on the left side, we essentially have the flow of this particular automation. The core concepts of how this works is that there's a trigger. So something makes this automation run. And then there's a condition typically, not always, but usually. And that's going to essentially prevent your rule from running in specific moments. And then there's an action which actually takes action on something specific. So really quick example of that is going to be, let's say an issue is created. So I'll say work item created, issue or work item. Work item is the new terminology and I should be saying that. I'm going to skip the conditions here. This is a fairly new way to do this, but it essentially works the same way. You could add a condition right inside of the trigger, or you could just click next. And then we have our condition block. So I'll add my condition block and I'll say work field condition. And maybe I'll pull in the request type being something very specific. So request type equals, maybe I'm going to trigger this on onboarding actually. And let me see if I have a request type like that. Perfect. Set up new employee. So essentially what this is doing so far is it's triggering when a rule is or a work item is created. And it's only going to continue if that work item is an onboarding request type. So essentially we're just triggering anytime a new onboarding is created. The next thing we have is our actions. So this is going to be anything that we want to take action on within Jira or even outside of Jira. We'll cover some of that a little bit later. But essentially we click on our actions and we have a list of items to choose from. The most common ones, and they kind of list them under the popular, but with all of this new stuff, it's hard to find a lot of it. But really the most common thing you're going to be doing is editing a work item. You're going to be transitioning a work item or creating a work item. You could also search for the different actions that you have. And really the way that I like to think about this is if I could do it manually in Jira, most likely I would say like 80 to 90% of the time, I could probably automate it. So think of creating a recurring reminder as a task in Jira or a work item that I need to do something weekly. If I'm doing that manually, I can probably automate it. Same thing with field value updates, with assignee updates, all that kind of stuff is possible with automation. There's some more advanced stuff, again, which I'll cover later that isn't available with specific actions or action blocks, but it are possible with some webhooks and HTTP requests. So we're going to be adding a very simple action, and I'm going to say we're going to edit the work item. So I'll pull that in, edit work item, and maybe we'll pull in the assignee, and then maybe we'll also add in a couple of subtasks. So the first thing I'll do is edit the work item and add the assignee in. And then I can't edit the work item to add a subtask. So I have to add another component, which is just going to be a secondary action. And then I'll search for subtask and we have a subtask action. You can also just create a work item and then select a subtask issue type. That's totally feasible. But subtask is a little bit cleaner if you're not adding any more context. So I'm going to drop that in. That way we could just add a summary and we could add multiple and we're good to go. So I'll say something along the lines of setup laptop, and then I'll say add Office 365 account. And here we go. This is our very first automation, and anytime a new work item is created, we are conditionally looking at if it's an employee or a new employee onboarding, and then we're running the two actions afterwards. Very simple, very straightforward, nothing too complicated or crazy here. I would really just spend some time, if you're very new to this, in the action section to understand what you can actually do. And some of them are very buried. For example, that edit work item, if I use that action, there's a lot of buried options under this. It essentially pulls in every custom field. So just know that there's a lot of little things inside of each of these primary actions that you could do. And when you click on them, there's typically a lot more options inside of them. There's also some very specific terminology within these particular actions and triggers as well. So if you're a little bit confused, I like to use ChatGPT and say like, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. What kind of actions or modules or blocks do I use in Jira Automations to make this happen? So ChatGPT it, see if it could kind of give you a rough idea of what you need. It doesn't do very well on very complex and more meticulous stuff, but it does do a good job of generally letting you know what the flow should look like and which blocks you need. So I'll pull all of these in, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this rule on. I'll go ahead and name this. And as I mentioned before, I have a very specific formula for this, which is trigger, and then action. In this case, it's a trigger of work item created. So I'll just say that. Work item created. I'll even say like onboarding created. That way we're more specific. And then I do a little arrow, and then I do a action. In this case, we have multiple. So I might do commas, or I might do one primary action. Really depends, but this gives me a very good idea when looking at the list of rules, exactly when it's happening and what it's doing. So onboarding created, this kind of encapsulates the first two. And then I'm going to go to assign and then create subtasks. I'll just say assign and create subtasks. There we go. So we'll keep it at that. I'll remove that because that wasn't needed. And under my rule details, we have the name. We also have the scope, which is either a specific project or multiple projects. So that's right there if you're looking in the global settings. Then there's the owner of the rule, which is just me by default. There's the actor, which is the user or essentially the user. So in this case, it's automation for Jira who's taking action on this. Everything in Jira is done by a user. For example, when you create a work item, there's a reporter involved. So the reporter in this case is going to be automation for Jira. And if you want that to be different, you just hit the drop down, select someone else, and that's it. And then you could ask to notify and set who can edit and actually jump into this rule and make changes. Other than that, I'm going to leave everything out of box. Typically, all I would end up doing is setting up my actions and then giving it a name. I'm going to change the condition to, or the trigger to something a little bit different. Work item created is actually what I want. I'm going to change the request type to something else. Or actually, I'll just remove it for the demo just to show you how it runs. That way there is, I don't have to go and create an onboarding since there's a lot of other automations tied to that specific item. I'll open up let me go to my full list of projects. And one thing to note on the automation that I just created, because it is global, it's gonna trigger across every single one of my projects. So keep an eye on that and make sure that you're only triggering where you want it to trigger. I'm gonna find a business project since those are fairly simple and easy to understand. Marketing content is a really great one to start with. And I'll just go ahead and drop in a new to-do item, test automation. And now all we have to do is give it a couple seconds. We should have the automation running, and then we should have the actions taking place. If we don't see those actions taking place, we can take a look, and I'll refresh just to make sure. We can take a look at our automation and take a look at our audit log to see what's happening. So it looks like nothing ran. I'm going to open up my system one more time, and we'll jump into our global automation, and then I'll find that exact rule that I just created, updated most recently. So I'll just pull that up in this list. It looks like it's enabled. Let's go to audit log. So it looks like there was a success. Subtasks were created. And this again is why I use the audit log inside of the actual automation, because I don't see all of this stuff here, which you could see more than one item ran even on this board. And if you have a lot of automations running at the same time, if you have a really big Jira environment, you're going to be looking at a lot of automations to try and find what you're looking for. So once again, I just like to go directly into here and audit log, and it looks like it did run. So I'll go back and just verify on that test automation. Oh, there we go. Looks like it just took a second, and we have our subtasks, but we don't have the assignee. So let's take a quick look and see what happened to this automation. So work item created, edit work item. Let's take a peek here. Issue edited successfully. And we have the two subtasks. So, the assignee was unassigned. That's why I thought I assigned it to myself. So everything did run correctly and did successfully run. Sometimes you will see a success icon next to it, even if certain parts or elements didn't run, just because of certain conditions that weren't met. So just keep that in mind and take a look at your audit logs. That's going to be your best friend to find out what's going on and why. But here's a very simple automation that we just created with a couple of subtasks. We could even take a look at the history, and we can see that the task was created. And we should see inside of each one of these the history of who created these subtasks, which was automation for Jira. As I mentioned earlier, if you change who that is inside of your settings, you're going to be seeing that individual. Like if I said it to myself, it would say that Josh created these subtasks. So if you did want this to take action on sort of behalf of someone, and in some cases you actually have to do that because of board permissions or project level permissions. So if you ever do run into an error where it says permissions not met or something along those lines, try switching the actor to somebody who does have permissions, and that might get you through that little problem. All right, so let's dive into each of these items a little bit more in depth, because there's obviously a lot more going on than just the very basic triggers and items that we have. The one thing that I'll mention first is that we do have a component. Let me update this really quick. We do have a component called branching. So I didn't mention this one, but it essentially allows you to branch the automation and add more actions and conditions. There's always only one trigger unless we specify multiple work item events. So it's still one trigger, but we're just having work items triggering this from multiple different events. If you wanted more triggers for an automation, you have to set up more automations. I'll show you a couple tricks on this later with like journeys and a couple other ways to make this process a little bit easier and actually trigger things at once. But just keep that in mind. If you want more than one trigger, you kind of have to set up more than one automation. So I'll go back to created. And speaking of branching, it's essentially just a branch, and you have advanced branching, AQL branching, which is assets based, and rule branching. Advanced branching is your Jira smart values, which I will cover shortly, which are insanely powerful and can do a lot in your Jira environment. And then we have a simple branch, which is essentially going to allow you to have the automation run, checks a branch, and then could run again, check the next branch. And something like this is useful for like multiple conditions. So if I have a condition as an example for work item condition, or maybe user condition, then I could add an action of maybe create another work item. I could copy this entire branch over. And now if this condition isn't met, I could add an entirely separate condition inside of here, and it'll run through both to find which one it should be running and run the ones with that particular condition that it needs to. There's also another way to do this, which I'll show in a little bit, but this is just one use for your branches, and it kind of helps things be a little bit more organized and run with conditions without stopping the entire automation tree. So if I moved this, for example, right here, and I had things below it that I wanted it to run, even if this didn't meet this particular user condition, it would essentially stop right here. The idea behind the branch is that I could tuck this into the branch, and this automation is going to run regardless. It just goes into this branch and checks this condition. If it's not met, it won't run. If it does, it does. But even if it's not met, it keeps going and runs the next one. And you keep going and like adding more actions, and your automation won't stop just because there's one condition there. So that's probably the most well-known use case of branches. And the biggest reason to use them. There's one more thing that was actually added in the past couple of weeks by Atlassian, which is this advanced branching sort of component. And this is essentially the same thing as a branch, but instead of having one branch, you could have multiple branches running at the same time. So if you had multiple actions that you wanted to be running consecutively, you could do that with this. And as you saw earlier, we had the branch, but in this case, we have multiple branches, and we could add more components. We could add more branches and do more things in this way. Some use cases here, I would say mostly with like things that you're running cross projects or things that you want to check and run at the same time. Otherwise, this is probably a little bit more niche for most and not super useful, especially if you're doing things with one single project. So diving into some of these more specific triggers, conditions, and actions. So there's a lot more that Atlassian is adding with these in particular, not just within Jira, but outside of Jira as well. For example, you could trigger things from Workday, and I believe there's a couple more. Like there's things from Compass, which are other Atlassian products. You could trigger from objects. You can manually trigger, which is really great. I'll be covering some of those manual triggers, which are absolutely incredible for automating a little bit more specific things where you still want a little bit of control. And then you have obviously all of your DevOps stuff, your version control, your work items, pretty much anything you could ever want, you can trigger on within Jira. This automation platform in general is pretty phenomenal and one of the best that I've seen across any software applications. So that's going to be our triggers. I'm going to cover the conditions because those can be pretty fancy if you'd like them to. Obviously, we have our work item conditions. So those are your most standard. You're just checking if a work item has a particular value or if a value is empty. Pretty standard, pretty basic stuff. You could also check for smart value conditions, which again, I'll be covering the smart values in just a moment, but these are insanely powerful, and I'll show you a very powerful automations using some smart values. We have some alerting related stuff, some AQL related stuff. AQL is asset query language, so if you're using Jira assets, this is going to come in very handy. Obviously, you have your typical JQL. How could you miss out on that? And then we have like user conditions. This is great for things like customer submitted something or did something versus an agent doing something. You could trigger and conditionally do things based on who did what. So for example, if a customer adds a comment, you can add that user condition, and that way you can make an action that maybe changes a status based on a customer's action versus an agent's. Work item attachments, work item field conditions, which is the same one here. It's just showing up twice since that one's in the popular recommended section. And then work item has design linked, which I believe is directly to Figma, integration directly to Figma. And then there's the if and else. So this is similar to branching, but this is really great to be able to take action on one particular item. And then if it doesn't meet that requirement, it's going to be adding an action to everything else. So for example, I could add a quick condition. So you pretty much add this if and else, and then you add another condition to it. So this might be a work item condition and work item field condition. Let's say the status is draft. Then we're going to add an action of maybe create another ticket or work item. So now we have our, there we go. So now we have our, essentially our first group of if, and then we could add, and for some reason, I am not able to add other components. Let me start this process over again. So if and else, add a condition, and I will add a work item field condition, status equals draft, next. Then we add an action of, let's do a subtask actually. Oh, we don't have a subtask. Create work item. Okay, then we're going to just specify a project, an issue type, test issue. All right, there we go. And for some reason, it's still not working. Oh, the trigger's not there. That is why. Work item created, there we go. So we are essentially triggering on work item equals or status equals draft. And then we are taking this action if it does equal that. Now we could add another component if we'd like more actions, or we can add an else, which is for anything else, we're going to do this instead. And I'll copy this over, throw it over here. And maybe in this case, I'm gonna say test issue 2. So if something's in draft, add this summary. If it's not, literally anything else, do this instead. So this saves you a lot of actions if you have something very specific, or if you're potentially going to be creating two automations, you can merge them into one using these if and else conditions. And you could keep adding components as well. You could keep adding more branches if you'd like. So you could have a lot of different branches listed with if else conditions. And this oftentimes has saved myself from creating like 10 different automations and bundling them into just a single one. So something super handy to look out for if you're checking a lot of things very specifically with one single trigger. So that's going to be our if and else conditions and all of our condition groups. Next, we obviously have the actions, which we already showed off some of these. Some of the most common ones I use was, as we already went over, creating work items, creating subtasks, editing fields, issues, adding comments. You could assign work items. What else can we do? We can log work, we can transition. Transitioning can't happen within editing a work item. We actually have to run in transition action, so do keep that in mind. You could send emails, Slack notifications, and some of the really cool stuff that Atlassian's been doing is adding these external third-party tool integrations as well. So for example, if you're running an onboarding, we could actually trigger and do things in Okta. We could trigger and do things in Azure. We can, on offboarding, suspend users in Okta. We can send document sign requests, which is really fantastic for, just like that onboarding or new contracts that are being signed. You could automate that entire process directly within Jira, whereas previously you had to include different APIs or like a Zapier or Workato tool as an intermediary to be able to run all of these items. So super cool, super handy. I would say I'm seeing like at least a couple of these added every single month. So by the time you look at this list may be way more full, but definitely check out in here if you're running any kind of automations with third-party tools to see if you could integrate them directly with automations. So that's going to be all of our actions and some of the stuff that I use most and some of the stuff that we use most with our clients. So smart values. Before I get into the next automation that I want to show you, which is a lot more complex and kind of stacked with multiple automations, I want to cover these smart values. These are essentially different things that Jira can pull context from. So for example, we have our issue smart values, which can pull everything from your issue into a Jira automation. So you could pull your summaries, your issue types, the time and date it was created. You could pull every single custom field. There's a custom field ID associated with every custom field, something like this. And you could pull that into a smart value inside of an automation. One super practical example of this is, let's say we're running an onboarding, and when the onboarding is created, we have the user's name inside of the summary line. What if we want to append into that data let's say that automation says, or as soon as an onboarding is created, we have a new work item created that says new onboarding, but we want to append the user's name into that onboarding. So it would say something like onboarding for John Smith. So in order to do that, we can pull whatever field value, whether that's a custom field, and we could append inside of our automation to our current issue summary the name of the individual that we're onboarding. So that's a very practical and simple example that we use all the time. And obviously there's a lot more things you could do here. And the one that I'm going to be showing, let me see if I could find it. So we have like projects, lists, text fields, conditional logic, date and time. This is the one I'm going to be using, which is really cool because you could pull in the current day, the current month with like text formatting and a whole bunch of other stuff. So check out your Jira Smart Values. All you have to do is Google this. I use ChatGPT for this all the time. For example, if I am going to be looking for the smart value for the month in text format, I could say, what is the Jira Smart value for current month text output? And instead of searching through all that documentation, this is what we have. So we have now format, open column, and then MMMM, and that's going to give us something like this, which is July. And I could say, hey, maybe give this for next month or previous month. So you can do quite a bit with this, and it gives you a lot of context to pull in, not only from within Jira, but just from general context and information about the things around you. So this is exactly what we're going to be using for our next automation. And what I'm going to do is something that we actually do internally at grid.io and something that we've set up for a couple of clients before, which is to have a multiple project automation. And this is going to be a little bit layered, and I'll explain why in just a moment. For being able to link things across certain boards completely automatically. So for our use case, what we do is we have a master project board. So this is our marketing content board, but we also have a marketing board for just our marketing tasks. And what we do is we create a work item for essentially creating all of our marketing material for the current month. So in this case, the month of July is what we might have. So I'll use this marketing software development board just as an example. That way we can use something cross-project since we want to have an automation that kind of runs between multiple different places. So I'll create one in here. I'll go to my project settings. I'm going to do it inside of the automations inside of my project this time. And I'm going to go in and create my very first rule, which in this case is going to be to once a month create the task for our marketing team to put out and schedule all of our content. So I'm going to add a scheduled trigger, and then we're going to set this to run once per month. And then we're going to say on the first day of the month, last day of the month, whatever day you want, you could set right here. I'm going to say it's going to be on the first day of the month, 9 a.m. CST time. So we're going to set that up and have it occur. And we also have essentially like a start date of when this will first kick off. So just keep that in mind. And then we have the schedule to kick off once a month. And all I'm going to do is add an action. Very simple action is to create a work item. And this is going to be named inside of the same project, same work type. I'm going to say just a standard task, actually. I'm going to say schedule content for, and in this case, maybe I want to pull in the month, which is exactly what we pulled out from ChatGPT. And I'll just copy and paste this over to my automation. So schedule content for smart value. Now, when we actually run this automation, we don't get this funky looking formatted text. We get the actual month. And I'll show you exactly what I mean when I run it. So we have everything we need here. We could obviously add more context. We have a bunch of descriptions in here. We have some subtasks for different platforms. So get as fancy or as crazy with this as you like. For this demo, I'm just going to use the parent task to link to it a little bit later. So this is step one of our automation. So I'll turn this on, and then I'll say schedule marketing content. So very simple. I'll turn this rule on. And if you don't want to wait for this to trigger, if you want to test it out, anytime that you're using the scheduled trigger, click on the three dots on the right side and then just hit run rule and it runs immediately. Go to our audit log and make sure, there we go. We ran into some errors immediately. Project or work type not set. So let's take a quick look back into our project and our rule details. And we have our, let's see. So we have our marketing scope. We have our run right here, and then our action, which was same project. Let's set the project to be more specific. Marketing software development. I think that's what was causing the problem. For some reason, it wasn't finding it. So let's update that, run it again, and see if we got rid of the error. And I'll be going through some more troubleshooting later because we're probably going to run into it. So back into my audit log, amazing success. Let's see, work item created, and let's jump in, take a quick look. So there we go. We have our newly created work item, and we don't see that weird information prepended. We see immediately that we need to create some content for July. So great use case for our marketing team. We now have a recurring task for them to schedule and create their content for a specific month. Phenomenal. So now let's take this a step further. So we have our master task, or like our parent task of all the content that's going out in July. So this is going to be on our master marketing board, or in this case, our software development board. Let's go into the marketing content board next and set up the following automation. I'll start from the project settings, but as you'll see in a little bit, we actually will need to take this to the global automation, and I'll show you how to do that exactly from here. So I'll go to my automation, and what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to create a rule, and I'll explain what this is as I'm building it. I'm going to create it from scratch, and I'm going to select this to be a manual trigger. And what we're trying to do is pull out individual pieces of content from this board to be linked to that master parent item on our other board to see all the content as a linked work item in one single Jira ticket. And I'll show you what that looks like at the end once we actually run it. But that's the concept of what we're trying to build. So we'll just set it to manually trigger. We'll leave everything as default because we want anybody to be able to trigger this. Then I will go to our if condition. We could add conditions if we need to. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as is, but you can make sure that it runs into specific items if you'd like, or actually I think we will need to run an if condition. Let's take a quick look. So yep, we will need to actually do it. So we will actually go in here, and what I'm going to do is go back to Jira, and I'm going to go to my, once it pulls up, I'm going to go to my filtered work items because I want to pull up a specific JQL, and my Jira environment's going to stop running mid-video, of course. Let's try this one more time. There we go. So I'm going to go to my search all work items inside of my filtered results, and I'm going to pull in a JQL to pull in the scheduled content for July. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say summary, and then we're going to add a little tilde, and it's already suggesting that. And then I'm going to add in specific information for scheduled content for July. So I'll open parentheses. I'll type in schedule. There we go. Content for, and I'll keep all the caps there as well. Schedule content for, and I'm going to close parentheses and search. Perfect. So we already have it. The only thing that we'll need to adjust when we go into our automations is the July part. Because if we have multiple that say July, August, and others, they're all going to be filtered up into these results. And we want to make sure we're selecting just July for this month. So I'll copy this over, and the reason I did this is just to make sure I have the right JQL and just to make sure it's pulling the correct work items when I'm searching for it. But I'll go back to my onboarding automation, and in this case, I'm going to do a branch, and we're going to branch on related work items. And what I'm going to do is actually search for JQL in here. So JQL, so what we're doing here is triggering, and then we're finding a specific work item using JQL, and I'm going to paste the exact thing that I just had with an extra smart value for the current month, of course. So I'll pull in that same exact smart value. And now when this actually runs, we're going to be pulling in and seeing, or Jira automation is going to be pulling in and seeing schedule content for July. And it's going to pull in the exact work item type. So schedule content for July, we could even validate this query if we're not using smart values. If we are using smart values, that is going to be grayed out, which is kind of a bummer. So pulling in JQL, we have our work item found. The next step is to add an action. And for this action, I'm going to link the work item. So what we're going to do is link so essentially we're finding the work item and then we're linking it back to the trigger work item. So that's all we really have to do. We found it, we action item from, we select the type of link it's going to be. There's a lot in this environment. I'm just going to say relates to, keep it very simple, and then we'll say trigger work item and we'll hit update. So now we have a manual automation and we could go to our marketing content board and I'll pull up a random piece of content and we should now, inside of this little automation icon, this is our manually run automations. We should be able to see that particular item on this board. And in this case, we don't see it. So when work item is created, that's the wrong trigger. Let me change that. Work or manually selected, manually triggered. There we go. So make sure your triggers are correct. I think I set that one up wrong. Let me refresh and see if it shows back up. So back on that same board, hover over this icon, click on it. There we go, onboarding created. And you can name this for something a little bit more user-friendly. That way, when users actually click on it, they have the ability to see exactly what it does. So now that we have that action, the whole goal of this automation is that when we click on it, we're going to be linking this particular work item to the parent work item. Now, I'm going to run this and it's going to not find anything. So I'll go back to my automation. I'll go to my audit log, no actions performed. And the reason is that it didn't actually find anything with that JQL. The reason it didn't find anything is because under the rule details, oh, this scope is global actually. I think I switched which automation I was running in the middle of this video. But if it's a single project, we need to make sure that it's switched to global or multiple projects so that it's searching across very specific projects and not just a single project. So in this case, let's troubleshoot and find out why we didn't find this particular work item. And the first thing I'm gonna do is actually add a log action. And I'm gonna add this first to make sure, and let me add another component right here. I'm gonna add in what we call a log action. So the log action essentially allows you to see what a smart value is gonna be inside of your automation audit log. So I'll add this log value. I'll pull this over to the top. I don't know why it wasn't letting me do that earlier, and I'll update that. So now when we trigger it, it's gonna log this time format to make sure that it's actually pulling correctly. Then it's gonna go through and find the JQL summary schedule content for this particular item. And I think I see the problem. It might be the parentheses. Nope, parentheses look good. So I will go ahead and run it one more time. So we've updated everything back to our board. And in this case, when we go to our audit log, once this runs, I'll show you exactly what it's going to look like. So looks like it did run successfully this time. Let's take a quick look. Oh, there we go. Log action for July. Branch to work item, link work items. Let's see if that one ran. Oh, nice, it did work this time. But the essential idea behind the logs is that we can have the ability to see what that smart value is. So we logged the action before the rule ran. That way it doesn't run into any blockers and doesn't cancel out before it's the very last thing. And we logged and saw that it's actually coming over as July, which is correct and accurate. And now we could go back to the work item and we could see that if I refresh, we have a couple of things linked here. I just want to make sure I'm finding the right one. There we go. We have scheduled content for July. And very simple, very straightforward. We now have our parent task, which is scheduled content for July, with all of our linked work items below, which is going to be all of our individual pieces of content. So I could go back to the marketing board. I could pick any one of these items, and let me make sure it's not the same one. And I could just rerun that same automation on all of these. That way, without finding and linking and going through and making sure that all of the correct items are linked to the correct parent task, I just run through these and run the automation really quick. And my job is done. I could just go back to the parent task and I've saved myself, maybe at least a couple minutes in total, maybe 5 minutes or so if I'm linking several of these across different projects. So going back to our software development board, I ran that a whole bunch of times. Let's see if I can pull up that scheduled content for July and see if we have all of them linked. Beautiful. So now we have all of our work items linked to scheduled content for July. We used our smart values to do this to make it very easy and very simple. We used our filtered Jira search results to automatically find this particular item using that smart value. And we were able to link all of our work items directly to it and save at least several minutes on that particular process. And really the whole goal of automation isn't to save yourself hours of time. The whole goal of every automation is to save yourself a few minutes here and there. And over time, as you start to create these and you create a lot of automations, maybe you have 10 or 20, you're all of a sudden saving a few hours per week just on some of your manual tasks. So anytime you're thinking of these automations, don't necessarily think to automate an entire process or SOP, which are absolutely possible and do get a little bit more complex. But the whole idea is to save yourself moments and times and little manual actions that you find yourself doing that you know you can automate within your Jira environment. And then, as I mentioned, it adds up and saves you quite a bit of time over a longer period of time of creating these. So that's going to be our more complex automations. And we've already touched on troubleshooting. Really, my whole process with troubleshooting is, first of all, go to the audit log, go through and see exactly why something may not have run. You could even see configuration changes in audit logs, which is great because if somebody comes in here and breaks your automation rule, you can see exactly what happened and who edited that rule, and you can go scold them for it. Don't do that, I'm just kidding. But you can see exactly when your automations rule fail, and then you could see into each individual branch or element and see where it failed and why. So you could even click on one of these and it takes you directly to that particular branch. And you could go through, troubleshoot, find out what's going on, and ultimately fix the problem. The next thing that I really like to do is to log those actions. Always make sure to log your actions if you're using any kind of smart values or you're pulling fields across different projects. This will immediately tell you if something's being broken in that process. Because oftentimes, if I didn't have this log action item and I didn't have the right smart value in here, I wouldn't even know why I was failing because it doesn't give me the output that it's supposed to use inside of this JQL. So logging is fantastic. And once I add those elements in, I make sure to check the audit log. One thing to keep in mind with those with those log actions are to remove them later. The reason I say to remove them is that because you're adding them, it takes up an automation rule limit. So for example, if I had a condition here and half of the time when this automation ran, the condition did not run or did not allow the automation to run, that essentially doesn't count towards my automation limit. But if you add a log action before that, you are technically successfully running something as an action anyway. And when that action runs, you're essentially pulling in information and you're using up your limit. So if you're testing it out, use your log action. Once you're done, remove them. So just a quick side note there. The last thing I wanted to chat about was the automation webhooks and journeys. I'm going to return to my rules and I'll create a new rule from scratch and I'll show you what that means. So we have incoming webhooks, but we also have webhooks we can send out, which is really great to automate between multiple platforms or do things that are not available as standard actions. For example, something that I like to do is automate between Confluence and Jira. And when we have an action, and I'll add a quick action as a Confluence page creation, when we add one of these actions, it's really difficult to embed specific information into our Confluence pages. The alternative is to add a webhook. And I won't be diving too deep into this because it does get very complex with your URLs, with your headers, your authentication, your content embedding. But the general idea is that you're inputting custom data into Confluence, and the APIs tend to be a lot more robust than what we have here available to us. Jira is very good at having all of these automations and all of these actions already available to us, so I rarely have to actually do webhooks. Some use cases where I do have to do webhooks are like actual project creation or other minute things or like even field creations. But with Confluence, the options are a little bit more limited, unfortunately, just because of the way it's designed. So oftentimes I actually just send a webhook with a custom payload, custom information. So definitely reach out to your IT team if you want to do something a little bit more advanced to see if it's possible and have them check out the API documentation for all of your products. But you could also send things outside of Jira from here. So if you're working with like Salesforce, or you're working with whatever other platform you may be using, you can actually send data to that platform directly from Jira without necessarily needing an intermediary product, something like a Zapier or Workato. And the last thing I wanted to chat about were journeys. So we mentioned that there's only one trigger available for an automation. But if I pop open really quick my IT support project and go to my project settings, inside of the feature for these JSM project, there is something called journeys. So if you toggle this on, you can see it as a very new feature. The idea behind this is that we can trigger when a work item is created. There's also one more trigger for, let's see what we have here. worker added to Workday. So I think the whole point of what they're doing here is really onboarding focused, but really our two options are currently Workday or work item. So the idea behind what we're doing here is that we can trigger across multiple different projects, multiple different automations. So we have our IT project, which maybe kicks off in onboarding. Then we have HR tasks that we can run with automation rules and multiple automation rules. Then we could have procurement tasks with multiple automation rules. And the idea is to trigger all of these from one place and have a lot of cross projects automations running. That way you could save yourself a little bit of time and kind of map out, let's say, your onboarding journey, but you could really use this for anything. And there's really two reasons you would want to use this. Number one is if there's more than one project that you're automating on, or number two, when there's more than one automation rule that you want to add to a trigger. So check this out if you're interested. This is probably going to be developed over the next few months a lot more. But right now, the biggest use case I see for this is general onboardings. Now, at this point, you should be pretty well versed with Jira automations. But if you wanted us to handle this or build any of these out for you, all you have to do is go to the first link in the description below to book a call with me. I'll see you there.